Picture this: Christmas morning, the most sacred day of the year, and I'm watching through my own kitchen window as another woman sits in my living room, unwrapping presents under the tree I spent weeks decorating. She's wearing my husband's old college sweatshirt, sipping coffee from my favorite mug, and acting like she belongs there. What she didn't realize was that while she was playing house in my home, I was upstairs gathering enough evidence to destroy her completely. By the time New Year's rolled around, the whole town knew exactly who Rachel Thompson really was, and it wasn't pretty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Susan Miller, and until 3 years ago, I thought I had the perfect small-town life. Millbrook, Iowa might only have 3,200 residents, but it was home to everything that mattered to me. Tree-lined streets where kids could ride their bikes safely, a main street with local businesses that knew your name, and neighbors who brought casseroles when someone was sick. I'd lived there my entire life, married my high school sweetheart, and raised 2 beautiful children in the same house where I dreamed of growing old. For 18 years, I was the wife who made everything work behind the scenes. While my husband, Mark, fixed cars at Henderson's auto shop, I managed our household finances, coordinated school events, volunteered at the community center, and worked part-time as the administrative secretary at Millbrook Community Church. That job meant more to me than just a paycheck. In a town our size, the church secretary knows everything about everyone. I handled prayer requests, maintained membership records, coordinated counseling appointments, and managed the benevolence fund that helped families in crisis. People trusted me with their deepest struggles, their financial hardships, their marriage problems, and their fears about their children. Emma was 16 and Tyler was 14, both honor roll students who played sports and helped with church youth activities. Emma inherited my organizational skills and was already talking about studying business in college. Tyler got his father's mechanical aptitude and could fix almost anything with an engine. We were the family other people pointed to as an example of stability and success. Sunday mornings found us in the third pew from the front, left side, the same spot we'd occupied for over a decade. Wednesday evenings, I taught women's Bible study while Mark coached Tyler's baseball team. Friday nights were reserved for high school football games where the whole community gathered under the lights. Christmas was always my specialty. Every November, I transformed our house into something magical. White lights outlined every window and doorframe. The mantel was draped with fresh garland and my grandmother's antique ornaments. I baked dozens of sugar cookies for the church sale, coordinated the children's Christmas pageant, and spent hours selecting just the right gifts for everyone on our list. Mark used to joke that I started planning next Christmas before the current one was over. Our tree was always real, always perfectly shaped, and always positioned in the front window where neighbors could admire it from the street. Those foundation years felt solid, permanent, unshakable. I believed Mark when he said I was the heart of our family. I believed him when he told me he couldn't imagine life without me. I believed him when he promised that no matter what challenges we'd face them together. Looking back now, I wonder how long those words had been empty before I finally noticed the echo. Mark worked hard at the auto shop, often staying late to finish complicated repairs or help customers who couldn't afford to be without their cars. I respected his work ethic and never complained when dinner got cold or when he missed Emma's choir concerts. He provided for our family, loved our children, and showed up for the important moments. When Tyler broke his arm during baseball season, Mark left work immediately and stayed at the hospital until the cast was dry. When Emma got her driver's license, he spent every weekend teaching her to parallel park in the church parking lot. Our marriage wasn't passionate anymore, but I told myself that was normal after 18 years. We'd settled into comfortable routines. Morning coffee together before the kids woke up. Brief conversations about schedules and grocery lists and who needed to pick up whom from which activity. Saturday mornings working in the yard while the kids slept in. Sunday afternoons watching Tyler's games or Emma's competitions. We still held hands during church prayers and kissed each other goodbye every morning. It wasn't the breathless romance of our teenage years, but it felt steady and safe. I managed our finances because Mark hated dealing with paperwork. I balanced the checkbook, paid the bills, handled the insurance claims, and planned our budget. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. The house was paid off, both kids had college funds, and we took a modest vacation every summer. I clipped coupons, shopped sales, and stretched every dollar without making anyone feel deprived. When unexpected expenses arose, I figured out how to cover them without creating stress for the family. The church work fulfilled me in ways that domestic life sometimes couldn't. Pastor Williams trusted me completely, knowing that sensitive information would never leave my office unless someone's safety was at risk. I coordinated support for families facing job loss, illness, or addiction. I connected young mothers with experienced mentors. I helped teenagers find scholarships and summer jobs. I matched elderly members with volunteers who could help with grocery shopping or yard work. The filing cabinets in my office contained 20 years of community history, personal struggles, and small-town secrets that people had shared in confidence. Wednesday evenings teaching women's Bible study were particularly meaningful. Our group included teachers, nurses, shop owners, farmers' wives, and retirees. We studied scripture, but we also shared prayer requests, celebrated answered prayers, and supported each other through difficulties. These women had taught me about marriage, motherhood, friendship, and faith. When someone's husband was deployed overseas, we organized meal trains and childcare. When someone faced cancer, we drove them to treatments and cleaned their houses. When someone's teenager was struggling, we prayed together and shared practical advice. My relationship with these women gave me perspective on marriage challenges. I'd counseled wives whose husbands struggled with unemployment, addiction, or infidelity. I'd seen couples rebuild after betrayal and others who couldn't survive the damage. I'd watched women discover strength they didn't know they possessed and others who chose to stay in destructive situations rather than face change. I thought my marriage was stronger than most because Mark had never given me serious reasons to doubt his faithfulness or commitment. The warning signs started so gradually that I almost missed them entirely. It began with small changes in routine that seemed insignificant at first. Mark started working later more frequently, claiming that the shop was busier than usual or that he was helping customers who couldn't afford to take their cars elsewhere. He began showering immediately after work instead of waiting until bedtime, saying he felt too dirty to relax. He started paying more attention to his appearance, buying new clothes and asking my opinion about cologne and hairstyles. These changes might have seemed positive if they hadn't been accompanied by increasing emotional distance. Our morning coffee conversations became shorter and more superficial. He stopped asking about my day or sharing details about his work. When I tried to discuss household matters or the children's activities, he seemed distracted, checking his phone or finding reasons to end the conversation. Physical affection decreased gradually but noticeably. Spontaneous hugs became rare. Casual touches while passing in the kitchen stopped happening. Even our goodnight kisses became perfunctory. The phone behavior was what finally caught my attention. Mark had never been particularly attached to his cell phone, often leaving it on the kitchen counter or forgetting to charge it completely. Suddenly, he kept it with him constantly, taking it to the bathroom, carrying it while doing yard work, and placing it face down during meals. When it buzzed with text messages, he would check it immediately and sometimes step outside or into another room to respond. When I asked who was texting so frequently, he would say it was customers with questions about their cars or his buddy Jake coordinating weekend fishing trips. The gift-giving changes were perhaps the most telling. Mark had never been creative with presents, usually asking me to pick out what I wanted or defaulting to practical items like kitchen appliances or gift cards. Suddenly, he was full of ideas about jewelry, perfume, and romantic gifts that seemed thoughtful but felt strange coming from him. When I expressed surprise at his newfound thoughtfulness, he would get defensive, saying he was trying to be a better husband and I should appreciate the effort instead of questioning his motives. One evening in November, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket while checking for tissues before doing laundry. It was from Miller's jewelry store downtown, dated 3 days earlier, for a gold necklace with a heart pendant that cost $400. I hadn't received any jewelry recently, and Christmas was still weeks away. When I asked Mark about it, he became agitated, saying he was planning ahead for Christmas and accusing me of snooping through his personal belongings. His reaction was so disproportionate to my simple question that I knew something was seriously wrong. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the small changes I'd been noticing and dismissing. The late nights at work. The increased attention to his appearance. The phone secrecy. The defensive responses to innocent questions. The expensive jewelry purchase that I'd never seen. The emotional distance that had been growing for months. Individually, these things could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. I started paying closer attention to details I'd previously ignored. I noticed that Mark's work clothes didn't always smell like motor oil and grease the way they used to. Sometimes they smelled like unfamiliar perfume or soap. I noticed that he was doing his own laundry more frequently, saying he didn't want to burden me with his dirty work clothes. I noticed that he was taking phone calls outside even when the weather was cold, claiming he needed privacy to discuss sensitive customer information. The breaking point came 2 weeks before Christmas. During what should have been the happiest time of the year. I was at church late on a Wednesday evening, finishing preparations for the children's Christmas pageant and organizing gift baskets for needy families. The work was taking longer than expected because several volunteers had canceled due to Sick children, leaving me to handle tasks that normally would have been shared among several people. Linda Patterson, one of my closest friends from Bible study, burst through the church office door looking stricken. Linda worked at the bank and knew everyone in town through her job as a loan officer. She was not prone to gossip or drama, which made her distressed appearance even more alarming. She stood in the doorway for several seconds, clearly struggling with whether to share whatever information had brought her there. When she finally spoke, her words shattered the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my life. She had seen Mark at the Riverside Diner earlier that evening, sitting in a corner booth with Rachel Thompson, the new bank teller who had moved to town 6 months earlier. They weren't conducting business or having a casual conversation between acquaintances. They were holding hands across the table, speaking in intimate whispers, and behaving like a couple deeply in love. Linda described how Mark had stroked Rachel's face tenderly, how they had fed each other bites of dessert, how they had kissed passionately in full view of other diners who recognized them both. She had watched from her car in the parking lot, hoping she was misunderstanding what she was seeing, but there was no innocent explanation for the intimacy she witnessed. When they left the diner, they walked to Mark's truck with their arms around each other, and Rachel kissed him goodbye before getting into her own car. The conversation that followed revealed that Linda had been seeing them together for several weeks but had hoped she was wrong about the nature of their relationship. She had wrestled with whether to tell me, knowing how devastating the information would be but feeling that I deserved to know the truth. Other people had noticed them together as well, and whispers were beginning to circulate around town. Linda couldn't bear the thought of me being the last to know about my own husband's affair. I sat in my church office chair, surrounded by Christmas decorations and charity donations, trying to process the reality that my marriage was over. The man I had loved and trusted for 18 years was not only cheating on me but doing it publicly. In our small town where everyone would eventually know. The humiliation was almost as painful as the betrayal itself. I thought about our children, who would have to face their classmates' whispers and pitying looks. I thought about the Christmas morning that was now ruined before it had even arrived. I thought about the life I had built that was crumbling while I sat in a church office surrounded by symbols of hope and faith. That night, I drove home in a daze, practicing what I would say to Mark and trying to prepare myself for a conversation that would change everything. The house was dark when I arrived, which meant Mark was still out somewhere with Rachel while I had been working late to serve the community we both claimed to love. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, crying and trying to summon the courage to confront him with what I had learned. When Mark finally came home an hour later, I was waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and a heart full of questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. He seemed surprised to see me awake, claiming he had been helping Jake move some furniture and hadn't realized how late it had gotten. The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others he had told over the past months. When I told him what Linda had seen, his face went through a range of emotions before settling on resignation. He didn't try to deny the affair or make excuses about being misunderstood. He simply sat down across from me at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations, and confirmed that he was in love with Rachel Thompson. He said it had started innocently when she brought her car to the shop for routine maintenance, but their connection had been immediate and powerful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He claimed he had tried to resist his feelings out of respect for our marriage and family, but eventually he couldn't fight what felt like destiny. The words that hurt most were when he said that Rachel made him feel alive again in ways he had forgotten were possible. He said their relationship reminded him of what passion felt like, what it meant to be excited about seeing someone, what it was like to feel young and adventurous. He said he hadn't realized how dead he had felt in our marriage until Rachel showed him what he had been missing. He claimed he hadn't intended to hurt me, but he couldn't give up the happiness he had found with her. I asked how long the affair had been going on, and he admitted it had started in September, 3 months earlier. I asked if he loved me at all anymore, and he said he would always care about me as the mother of his children and his partner in building our life together, but he wasn't in love with me anymore. I asked if he had any intention of ending the relationship with Rachel, and he said he couldn't do that because she was his future now. The conversation lasted until 3 in the morning, covering practical questions about telling the children, dividing assets, and handling the inevitable gossip that would consume our small town. Mark wanted to wait until after Christmas to make any major changes, claiming he didn't want to ruin the holiday for Emma and Tyler. He promised to be discreet about his relationship with Rachel until we figured out how to handle the situation properly. He asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive him eventually and remain friends for the sake of our children. I agreed to keep quiet until after Christmas, partly for the children's sake and partly because I needed time to process everything and make plans for my future. Mark seemed relieved by my calm response, perhaps expecting more tears, accusations, and dramatic confrontations. He went to sleep in the guest room that night, claiming he wanted to give me space to think, but I suspect he was relieved to avoid the awkwardness of sharing a bed with me after confessing his infidelity. Christmas Eve arrived with all the traditions that had once brought me joy but now felt hollow and performative. I attended the late service at church, lighting candles and singing carols while my heart was breaking. The children were excited about Christmas morning, unaware that their family was falling apart behind the facade of normalcy their parents were maintaining. I smiled and played my role, taking communion and shaking hands during the peace, acting like everything was fine while inside I was planning for a future I had never imagined. When I returned home from church at 11 o'clock that night, I discovered that Mark's promise of discretion had been another lie. Rachel's red Honda Civic was parked in my driveway like she belonged there. Through the front window of my own house, I could see her sitting on my sofa, drinking wine from my good crystal glasses, laughing with Mark like they were celebrating their own private Christmas. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching them through the window and feeling a rage I had never experienced before. This was my home, decorated with ornaments I had collected over 18 years of marriage. This was my Christmas tree, carefully selected and lovingly decorated while Mark was supposedly at work. These were my traditions being violated by a woman who had blown into town 6 months ago and decided she wanted my life. When I finally gathered the courage to go inside, Rachel didn't have the decency to look embarrassed or apologetic. Instead, she smiled at me like we were old friends and said she hoped I didn't mind her being there for Christmas morning. She said Mark had told her so much about me and that she thought it would be nice for the children to see all the adults in their lives getting along during the holidays. She spoke as if she had a legitimate place in my family, as if her relationship with Mark gave her rights to my home and my children's Christmas morning. The audacity of her words and the casual way she claimed space in my life sparked something deep inside me that had been building for months. This woman had stolen my husband, was sitting in my living room on Christmas Eve, and was now suggesting that I should be grateful for her presence during my children's Christmas morning. She was acting like the gracious winner extending charity to the defeated opponent, expecting me to be thankful for her generosity in allowing me to participate in my own family's holiday celebration. That night, while Mark and Rachel slept in my guest room, I sat in my home office surrounded by filing cabinets full of church records and community information, and I began to plan Rachel Thompson's complete and total destruction. While Mark and Rachel slept peacefully in my guest room, I spent Christmas night wide awake in my home office, staring at 20 years' worth of community records and feeling something shift inside me. The woman who had spent decades organizing church potlucks and maintaining membership rolls was about to become someone entirely different. I pulled out the volunteer application that Rachel Thompson had submitted in October when she'd expressed interest in helping with our youth ministry. As church secretary, background checks were routine for anyone wanting to work with children or handle money. Most people in Millbrook had lived there for generations, so verification was usually a formality. But newcomers required more thorough investigation, especially when they wanted access to vulnerable populations. Rachel's application immediately raised questions that I had noted but not pursued at the time, assuming Pastor Williams would handle any concerns. Her previous address in Cedar Rapids led to a vacant lot when I used Google Earth to verify the location. The phone numbers for her personal references were all disconnected when I called them weeks later. Her employment history had gaps that she explained as time spent caring for a sick relative, but she provided no contact information for that relative or medical documentation to support her claim. Most troubling, her emergency contact was listed as a friend named Maria Santos, but when I tried to reach Maria, the number belonged to a pizza restaurant that had been closed for 6 months. That Christmas night, I decided to dig deeper into Rachel Thompson's background using every resource available to me. The church had memberships with several databases that helped us verify volunteer credentials and conduct background screenings. We also had connections with other churches throughout Iowa that often shared information about problem individuals who moved from congregation to congregation. My position gave me access to public records, social media accounts, and community networks that most people couldn't navigate effectively. I started with basic internet searches, something I should have done months earlier. Rachel Thompson appeared to have virtually no social media presence before arriving in Millbrook, which was unusual for someone her age. Her Facebook account had been created just days before she applied for her job at the bank, and it contained only a handful of photos with no tagged friends or family members. Her Instagram account was equally sparse, featuring generic sunset photos and inspirational quotes but nothing personal or authentic. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that Rachel Thompson was not who she claimed to be. I spent hours cross-referencing her information with public records, court documents, and newspaper archives. Around 4 in the morning, I finally found what I was looking for. Hidden deep in the Cedar Rapids Gazette archives was a small article about embezzlement charges filed against a bank employee named Rebecca Torres. The photograph accompanying the article showed a woman who looked remarkably similar to Rachel Thompson, though with darker hair and different styling. According to the article, Rebecca Torres had been accused of stealing $15,000 from customer accounts over a 6-month period. She had disappeared before her court date, leaving behind forged documents and a trail of financial fraud. The article mentioned that she was married to Carlos Torres and had a 7-year-old daughter named Sofia. My hands trembled as I printed the article and began searching for more information about Rebecca Torres. I found marriage records, birth certificates, and court documents that painted a picture of a woman with a history of deception and financial crimes. She had been arrested twice for check fraud before the embezzlement charges, though she had received probation both times. Her marriage to Carlos Torres appeared to be legitimate, and court records showed that he had filed a missing person report when she disappeared with their life savings. I spent the remainder of Christmas night creating a comprehensive file on Rebecca Torres/Rachel Thompson. I printed photographs, court documents, newspaper articles, and social media posts from accounts she had abandoned when she fled Cedar Rapids. By sunrise, I had enough evidence to prove that the woman sleeping in my guest room with my husband was a wanted fugitive who had stolen money from her previous employer and abandoned her own child. But I didn't stop there. I realized that if Rachel was using false identification, she was probably committing fraud at her current job as well. I made a mental note to pay closer attention to her activities at First National Bank, where she handled customer accounts and had access to sensitive financial information. If she had stolen money once, she was likely doing it again, especially since she needed funds to maintain her new identity and lifestyle. The discovery of Rachel's true identity gave me something I hadn't felt since learning about the affair: power. For months, I had felt helpless and invisible, watching my marriage crumble while being expected to maintain a facade of normalcy. Now I had information that could destroy Rachel completely and expose Mark as either a fool who had been deceived or an accomplice in harboring a fugitive. Either way, their relationship was built on lies that I could expose whenever I chose. Christmas morning arrived with all the artificial cheerfulness that Mark and Rachel had orchestrated for the children's benefit. Emma and Tyler woke early, excited about presents and unaware that their mother had spent the night documenting their father's girlfriend's criminal history. I played my role perfectly, making coffee and breakfast while Mark and Rachel acted like a blended family celebrating their first Christmas together. Watching Rachel open gifts under my tree while wearing my husband's clothing was surreal, but I no longer felt helpless. Every smile she directed at my children, every casual touch she shared with Mark, every moment she acted like she belonged in my house only strengthened my resolve to expose her completely. She had no idea that I knew exactly who she was or what she had done, which gave me a significant advantage in planning my strategy. Over the next several days, I carefully considered my options. I could call the police immediately and have Rachel arrested, but that would create chaos for my children and might generate sympathy for Mark as the victim of a con artist. I could confront Mark privately with the evidence and demand that he end the relationship, but that would give Rachel time to disappear again before facing consequences for her crimes. I could expose her publicly in a dramatic confrontation, but that approach would make me appear vindictive and unstable. Instead, I decided to orchestrate Rachel's downfall methodically, using my connections and knowledge to ensure that she faced consequences for every lie she had told and every crime she had committed. My plan would unfold gradually, allowing the truth to emerge naturally while positioning me as a concerned community member rather than a vengeful ex-wife. I wanted Rachel to experience the same humiliation and powerlessness that she had inflicted on me, and I wanted Mark to understand the depth of his poor judgment in choosing her over our family. My first step was to contact Carlos Torres, Rebecca's abandoned husband who was still searching for his missing wife. I found his phone number through public records and waited until I had privacy to make the call. When Carlos answered, his voice was weary and defeated, suggesting that he had received many false leads about his wife's whereabouts. I explained that I might have information about Rebecca Torres and provided enough details to convince him that I was serious. Carlos confirmed everything I had discovered through my research. Rebecca had cleaned out their savings account, maxed out their credit cards, and disappeared without explanation 8 months earlier. She had left behind a daughter who asked daily when mommy was coming home and a husband who had been struggling to rebuild their financial stability while maintaining hope that his wife would return safely. Carlos had hired a private investigator initially, but the cost had become prohibitive, forcing him to rely on occasional police updates and his own internet searches. When I described the woman living in Millbrook under the name Rachel Thompson, Carlos became emotional. He begged me for her exact location and contact information, explaining that he didn't want to punish Rebecca but needed closure for himself and their daughter. He said Sophia had been having nightmares and behavioral problems at school since her mother's disappearance, and that family counselors had recommended locating Rebecca to provide stability for the child, even if the marriage couldn't be salvaged. I agreed to help Carlos reconnect with his wife, but I asked him to wait while I gathered additional evidence to ensure that Rebecca couldn't disappear again before facing responsibility for her actions. I explained that she was currently involved with a married man and might have committed additional crimes since leaving Cedar Rapids. Carlos agreed to be patient, though I could hear the desperation in his voice when he spoke about his daughter's need for answers. My second step was to investigate Rachel's activities at First National Bank more thoroughly. I had noticed that she often worked late or came in on weekends, claiming dedication to customer service, but her behavior seemed excessive for someone in an entry-level position. I also remembered conversations with other bank customers who had mentioned small discrepancies in their account balances, though nothing significant enough to warrant formal complaints. I decided to monitor Rachel's work patterns and see if I could identify any irregularities in her customer interactions. This required careful observation without appearing suspicious, so I began visiting the bank more frequently for legitimate transactions while paying attention to Rachel's behavior with other customers. I also started conversations with bank employees who might have insights into Rachel's work habits or any concerns about her performance. Janet Morrison, the head teller who had worked at First National for over a decade, mentioned during casual conversation that Rachel often volunteered to handle complex transactions that other tellers avoided. Janet assumed this demonstrated ambition and customer service commitment, but she had noticed that Rachel preferred to work alone on these transactions rather than asking for assistance or supervision. Janet also mentioned that Rachel often stayed after hours to balance her drawer, claiming that she wanted to ensure accuracy rather than rushing through closing procedures. These observations suggested that Rachel might be manipulating customer accounts during complex transactions or using after-hours access to cover her tracks. I realized that exposing her theft at the bank would require cooperation from law enforcement and bank management, so I began planning how to present my concerns without revealing my personal motivation for investigating her background. My third step was to document Rachel's relationship with Mark in ways that would support future legal proceedings. I began photographing their public displays of affection, saving text messages that Mark left on his phone, and recording times when Rachel's car was parked at our house overnight. This evidence would be crucial if Mark attempted to deny the affair or claim that Rachel had deceived him about her marital status. I also started preparing for the practical aspects of divorce by consulting with an attorney in Cedar Rapids who specialized in complex cases involving fraud and hidden assets. I wanted to ensure that Rachel's criminal activities didn't impact my ability to secure fair financial support for my children or claim my rightful share of marital property. The attorney advised me to document all of Mark's financial activities and any gifts or expenses related to his relationship with Rachel. My fourth step was to build a network of allies who could support my efforts to expose Rachel without compromising my reputation in the community. I confided in Pastor Williams about my concerns regarding Rachel's volunteer application, presenting the information as routine due diligence rather than personal investigation. I also spoke with Linda Patterson about my worries regarding Rachel's influence on Mark's judgment, framing my concerns as friendship rather than revenge. These conversations allowed me to share critical information while maintaining plausible deniability about my true motivations. Pastor Williams agreed to review Rachel's background more thoroughly and potentially restrict her access to church activities. Linda offered to monitor Rachel's activities at the bank and report any suspicious behavior to management. Both women expressed concern about the impact of Mark's affair on our children and promised to support me through whatever challenges lay ahead. New Year's Day provided the perfect opportunity to begin implementing my plan. Mark had spent New Year's Eve with Rachel at a party I wasn't invited to, leaving me home with the children who were disappointed by their father's absence but too polite to complain directly. His behavior was becoming increasingly obvious to Emma and Tyler, though they hadn't yet confronted him about the changes in our family dynamic. That morning, I made my first strategic move by calling Detective Morrison in Cedar Rapids to report information about a wanted fugitive. I explained that I was a church secretary who had discovered discrepancies in a volunteer application and believed that a woman living in Millbrook might be using false identification. I provided Rachel's current name and address, along with evidence linking her to Rebecca Torres, and requested that they investigate the connection. Detective Morrison was immediately interested in my information, confirming that Rebecca Torres remained wanted on embezzlement charges and that they had been unable to locate her for months. He explained that fleeing before trial had resulted in additional charges and that Rebecca now faced potential prison time rather than the probation she might have received originally. He promised to contact Millbrook police and coordinate efforts to apprehend her, though he warned that the process might take several weeks due to jurisdictional procedures. My second move was visiting Tom Henderson at the auto shop where Mark worked. Tom had always treated me with respect and had expressed concern about the changes in Mark's behavior over recent months. I explained that I was worried about Mark's judgment and wondered if Tom had noticed any problems with his work performance or reliability. I didn't mention the affair directly, but I suggested that Mark might be involved in a situation that could reflect poorly on the business. Tom confirmed that Mark had been distracted and unreliable lately, often leaving work early or taking extended lunch breaks without explanation. Several customers had complained about delayed repairs or poor communication about their vehicles. Tom had been planning to discuss these issues with Mark but had hesitated out of respect for our family's long-standing relationship with the business. I suggested that Tom investigate the situation more thoroughly, hinting that Mark's problems might be more serious than simple distraction. My third move was scheduling a meeting with Linda Patterson at the bank to discuss my concerns about Rachel's background and behavior. I presented Linda with copies of the documents I had discovered, explaining that I had uncovered this information while conducting routine background checks for the church. Linda was shocked by the evidence of Rachel's true identity and criminal history, immediately recognizing the implications for the bank's security and reputation. Linda promised to report my findings to bank management and cooperate with any investigation into Rachel's activities. She also agreed to monitor Rachel's interactions with customers and look for signs of fraudulent behavior. Linda mentioned that she had already noticed some irregularities in cash drawer balances and customer account activity since Rachel's employment began, though she hadn't connected these issues to intentional theft. My fourth move was contacting Carlos Torres to provide him with updated information about his wife's location and activities. I explained that law enforcement was now involved and that Rebecca would likely be arrested within weeks. Carlos was grateful for my efforts but also concerned about the impact of his wife's arrest on their daughter, who still hoped for her mother's return. I assured him that exposing Rebecca's crimes was necessary for everyone's safety and that his daughter deserved to know the truth about her mother's choices. These initial strikes created momentum that I knew would be difficult for Rachel to stop once the consequences began accumulating. Law enforcement was actively pursuing her arrest. Her employer was investigating her activities. Her lover's boss was questioning his reliability. Her abandoned husband was preparing to reclaim his life. The walls were closing in around Rachel Thompson, and she had no idea that the quiet church secretary she had dismissed was orchestrating her complete destruction. Within 48 hours of my strategic strikes, the facade that Rachel had built around her new identity began crumbling in spectacular fashion. Detective Morrison contacted Millbrook Police Chief Davis to coordinate Rebecca Torres's arrest, and Chief Davis immediately recognized the name Rachel Thompson as the bank employee who had been dating Mark Miller. The small-town connections that Rachel had exploited to blend into our community now worked against her as law enforcement officers compared notes about her activities and relationships. Wednesday morning brought the first major development when Bank President Robert Chin called an emergency meeting with Linda Patterson and the other senior staff members. Linda had presented my evidence to management the previous day, and they had spent Tuesday evening reviewing Rachel's transaction records and customer account activities. What they discovered was a sophisticated scheme involving small withdrawals from multiple accounts, altered deposit slips, and forged signatures that had netted Rachel approximately $3,000 over 4 months. The bank's investigation revealed that Rachel had been targeting elderly customers and individuals who rarely checked their account balances carefully. She would reduce their deposits by small amounts or create phantom withdrawals during complex transactions, banking, on the assumption that minor discrepancies would go unnoticed. When customers did question irregularities, Rachel would apologize for clerical errors and correct the amounts, but only after determining whether the customers were likely to pursue the matter further or report their concerns to management. Mr. Chin immediately terminated Rachel's employment and contacted law enforcement to report the theft. He also initiated procedures to notify affected customers and arrange restitution for stolen funds, though he warned Linda that the bank's reputation could suffer significant damage if news of the theft became public before they could address the situation properly. Linda assured him that the information would remain confidential until authorities completed their investigation. That same morning, Tom Henderson confronted Mark about his deteriorating work performance and unreliable behavior. Tom had spent Tuesday evening reviewing customer complaints and documenting instances where Mark had failed to meet professional standards. The conversation quickly escalated when Tom mentioned rumors about Mark's involvement with someone who might have questionable character or legal problems. Mark became defensive and accused Tom of listening to gossip, but his reaction confirmed Tom's suspicions that personal problems were affecting his job performance. Tom issued Mark an ultimatum: end whatever personal situation was causing problems at work or find employment elsewhere. He explained that Henderson's auto shop had built its reputation on reliability and integrity, and that Mark's recent behavior was jeopardizing relationships with long-term customers. Tom also mentioned that he had heard concerning information about Mark's girlfriend that might reflect poorly on the business if their relationship became public knowledge. Mark left work early that day, visibly shaken by Tom's ultimatum and confused about how his boss had learned details about his personal life. He called Rachel immediately to warn her that people were asking questions about her background, but Rachel's phone went straight to voicemail because she was meeting with bank security and law enforcement officers about the theft investigation. By Wednesday afternoon, Rachel realized that her carefully constructed new life was collapsing rapidly. The bank had terminated her employment, frozen her access to customer accounts, and threatened criminal prosecution for theft. Detective Morrison had contacted her directly to schedule an interview about the embezzlement charges from Cedar Rapids, making it clear that her true identity was no longer secret. Chief Davis had warned her not to leave town while investigations were ongoing, effectively trapping her in Millbrook until authorities decided whether to arrest her immediately or allow her to surrender voluntarily. When Mark arrived at Rachel's apartment that evening, he found her packing frantically and preparing to disappear again. She confessed that her real name was Rebecca Torres, that she was wanted on criminal charges in Cedar Rapids, and that she had been stealing money from the bank to fund their relationship. She begged Mark to come with her, claiming that they could start over somewhere else and build a legitimate life together once the legal problems were resolved. Mark was devastated by these revelations, realizing that the woman he had fallen in love with was a criminal who had been lying about everything from the beginning. He understood that his affair had not only destroyed his marriage but had also made him an unwitting accomplice in harboring a fugitive and potentially benefiting from stolen money. The romantic gifts Rachel had given him, the expensive dinners they had shared, and the luxurious weekend trips they had taken were all funded by money she had stolen from bank customers, including people he knew personally. The confrontation between Mark and Rachel lasted for hours, with Rachel alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations that Mark was abandoning her when she needed him most. She claimed that she had genuinely fallen in love with him and had hoped to leave her criminal past behind by starting fresh in Millbrook. She insisted that the bank theft was a momentary lapse in judgment motivated by her desire to impress Mark and maintain their relationship, not a calculated scheme to defraud customers. Mark ultimately refused to flee with Rachel, telling her that he couldn't abandon his children or become a fugitive himself. He also expressed horror at learning that their relationship had been built on stolen money and false identity, making him question whether anything about their connection had been genuine. Rachel responded with fury, accusing Mark of being a coward who had used her for excitement but lacked the courage to fight for their relationship when challenges arose. Thursday morning brought the final collapse when Detective Morrison arrived in Millbrook with arrest warrants for Rebecca Torres on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and fleeing prosecution. Chief Davis coordinated the arrest to minimize public spectacle, but word spread quickly through town that Rachel Thompson had been taken into custody as a wanted fugitive. The bank issued a statement acknowledging the theft and assuring customers that their funds were protected, though details about the investigation remained confidential pending legal proceedings. Mark called me that afternoon in a state of complete emotional breakdown, confessing everything about Rachel's true identity and criminal activities. He sobbed as he described how thoroughly he had been deceived and how his poor judgment had nearly destroyed our family for a relationship based entirely on lies. He begged for forgiveness and asked whether there was any possibility of rebuilding our marriage, though he seemed to understand that the damage might be irreparable. I listened to Mark's confession with carefully controlled emotions, expressing appropriate shock and sympathy while revealing nothing about my role in exposing Rachel's true identity. I told him that I was relieved he had learned the truth before becoming more deeply involved with a criminal, and I suggested that he focus on explaining the situation to our children and rebuilding their trust in his judgment. I did not offer false hope about reconciliation, but I also didn't close the door completely on future discussions about our marriage. The revelation of Rachel's arrest and criminal history sent shockwaves through Millbrook, with neighbors and church members expressing disbelief that such deception could occur in their close-knit community. Many people praised my strength and dignity in handling Mark's affair, unaware that I had orchestrated Rachel's downfall through careful investigation and strategic planning. I accepted their sympathy graciously while privately savoring the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served through my own efforts rather than chance or coincidence. The arrest of Rebecca Torres sent ripples through Millbrook that extended far beyond the immediate scandal of her criminal activities. Within hours of her being taken into custody, details about her deception began spreading through the interconnected networks that make small towns both comforting and claustrophobic. The woman who had charmed her way into our community, stolen money from local bank customers, and destroyed my marriage was now facing the complete obliteration of the false identity she had worked so hard to construct. Friday morning brought a parade of phone calls from neighbors, church members, and acquaintances who had heard fragments of the story and wanted confirmation or additional details. I fielded these conversations carefully, expressing appropriate shock and concern while avoiding any indication that I had played a role in exposing Rachel's true identity. When people asked how I was handling the revelation that my husband's girlfriend was a wanted criminal, I responded with dignity and restraint, focusing on my relief that the truth had emerged before Mark became more deeply involved with someone so dangerous. The children's reactions were particularly heartbreaking to witness. Emma and Tyler had been confused by the changes in their father's behavior for months, but they had never imagined that his girlfriend was a fugitive who had been stealing money from people they knew. Tyler was angry and embarrassed, worried about what his friends would say when they learned that his dad had been dating a criminal. Emma was more concerned about the impact on our family's reputation and whether the scandal would affect her college applications or social relationships. I spent considerable time reassuring both children that they were not responsible for their father's poor judgment and that our family would survive this crisis with our integrity intact. I explained that sometimes people we trust make terrible decisions, and that Rachel's deception was sophisticated enough to fool many people beyond just Mark. I emphasized that their father loved them and that his involvement with Rachel didn't reflect his feelings for his children, though I privately wondered whether Mark's judgment could ever be fully trusted again. Mark's emotional state deteriorated rapidly as the full scope of his humiliation became apparent. Not only had he destroyed his marriage for a woman who was lying about everything, but he had also become the subject of town gossip and professional speculation. Tom Henderson had made it clear that Mark's job was in jeopardy, not just because of his recent poor performance but because his association with a criminal reflected poorly on the auto shop's reputation. Several customers had already asked Tom whether they should take their business elsewhere, worried about the judgment and integrity of employees who dated thieves and fugitives. The bank's investigation revealed that Rachel had targeted several elderly customers who were well known and respected in the community. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, a 92-year-old widow who had taught Sunday school for 60 years, discovered that Rachel had stolen over $400 from her account through a series of small withdrawals disguised as service fees. Harold Peterson, a retired farmer who struggled with arthritis and relied on others to help him with banking, found that Rachel had reduced his Social Security deposits by small amounts each month, assuming he wouldn't notice the discrepancies. These revelations transformed community sympathy for Rachel from curiosity about her criminal charges to genuine anger about her exploitation of vulnerable residents. The fact that she had targeted elderly customers while presenting herself as a caring young woman who was eager to help them with their banking needs made her crimes particularly offensive to people who valued respect for elders and community trust. Several families began questioning whether they could continue doing business with First National Bank, worried about security procedures that had allowed such theft to continue undetected for months. Church members were equally disturbed by Rachel's attempt to gain access to youth ministry activities through false volunteer applications. Pastor Williams called a special meeting with parents to explain that Rachel's background check had revealed discrepancies that prevented her from working with children, though he didn't elaborate on the specific criminal charges she was facing. Several parents expressed outrage that someone with a history of fraud and deception had been allowed to attend church activities where she could have targeted their children or gained access to personal information about families. The social dynamics of Millbrook's close-knit community meant that Rachel's deception affected relationships beyond those directly involved in her crimes. Families who had welcomed her into their homes for dinner or invited her to social gatherings felt violated and embarrassed by their inability to recognize her true character. Women who had befriended her and shared personal information worried about how she might have used their confidences or whether she had been gathering intelligence for future criminal activities. Linda Patterson became an unexpected hero in the community's narrative about Rachel's exposure, though she was careful to credit routine bank security procedures rather than taking personal responsibility for uncovering the theft. Linda's reputation as a thorough and principled employee was enhanced by her role in protecting customers from further fraud, and several people praised her dedication to safeguarding the community's financial interests. I was pleased to see Linda receive recognition for her efforts, especially since she had acted on information I provided while maintaining discretion about the source of her concerns. The legal proceedings against Rachel moved forward with surprising efficiency, aided by her decision to confess to the charges rather than prolonging the process through contested hearings. Her attorney advised her that cooperation with authorities might result in reduced sentencing, and Rachel seemed to understand that her pattern of fleeing from legal consequences had exhausted the patience of prosecutors and judges. Detective Morrison transported her back to Cedar Rapids to face the original embezzlement charges, while local authorities prepared their case regarding the theft from First National Bank customers. Carlos Torres arrived in Millbrook during the weekend to meet with law enforcement and begin proceedings to reclaim custody of his daughter. He also requested a meeting with me to express his gratitude for my role in locating his missing wife, though I was careful to downplay my involvement and emphasize the collaborative efforts of multiple people who were concerned about Rachel's behavior. Carlos was a soft-spoken man who seemed more relieved than angry about his wife's arrest, explaining that he had primarily wanted closure for their daughter rather than punishment for Rebecca. During our conversation, Carlos shared details about Rebecca's pattern of deception that extended far beyond the crimes she had committed in Cedar Rapids and Millbrook. She had been arrested for check fraud twice before their marriage, though. She had convinced him that those incidents were youthful mistakes that she had learned from completely. She had also been fired from previous jobs for theft and dishonesty, but she had always managed to find new employment by providing false references and fabricating work history. Carlos explained that Rebecca's abandonment of their daughter had been particularly devastating because Sophia had adored her mother and couldn't understand why she had disappeared without explanation. The little girl had been attending counseling to cope with feelings of abandonment and self-blame, wondering whether she had done something wrong to make her mother leave. Carlos hoped that learning the truth about Rebecca's legal troubles would help Sophia understand that her mother's disappearance was not related to anything Sophia had done or failed to do. The conversation with Carlos reinforced my conviction that exposing Rachel's true identity had been the right decision, not just for my own family but for all the people she had hurt through her pattern of deception and abandonment. Her crimes extended beyond simple theft to include emotional trauma inflicted on innocent children, elderly customers, and community members who had trusted her with their friendship and confidence. She had exploited the kindness and generosity of small-town residents who were accustomed to welcoming newcomers and giving people the benefit of the doubt. Mark's attempts to rebuild relationships with our children were complicated by their difficulty understanding how he could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone with such an extensive criminal history. Tyler, in particular, struggled with anger toward his father for choosing Rachel over our family, especially now that it was clear she had never been worthy of that choice. Emma was more forgiving but also more cautious, recognizing that Mark's judgment had been compromised in ways that might affect his parenting decisions and family priorities. I found myself in the unexpected position of defending Mark to our children while maintaining appropriate boundaries about our marital future. I explained that Rachel's deception was sophisticated and that even law enforcement professionals sometimes struggled to identify people who were skilled at creating false identities and manipulating others. I emphasized that Mark's love for them was genuine, even though his romantic choices had been disastrous, and that they should focus on rebuilding trust in their relationship with their father rather than punishing him indefinitely. The community's response to our family's crisis was overwhelmingly supportive, with neighbors offering practical assistance and emotional encouragement during a difficult time. Several church families invited us for dinner, understanding that cooking and maintaining normal routines was challenging while dealing with the emotional aftermath of betrayal and public scandal. The women's Bible study group rallied around me with offers of childcare, household help, and companionship, demonstrating the strength of relationships I had built through years of service and friendship. Pastor Williams scheduled individual counseling sessions with each family member to help us process the emotional impact of recent events and develop healthy strategies for moving forward. He was particularly concerned about the children's ability to trust adults and form healthy relationships in the future, recognizing that witnessing a parent's catastrophic judgment could create lasting psychological effects. He also offered to facilitate family counseling sessions if Mark and I decided to explore reconciliation, though he emphasized that such decisions should be made carefully and with professional guidance. As the legal machinery ground into motion around Rachel's multiple criminal charges, Mark's desperation intensified in ways that surprised even me. The man who had been so confident about his choice to pursue a younger woman and leave our marriage behind was now facing the complete collapse of his professional reputation, social standing, and financial security. His affair had not only cost him his family but had also made him the subject of community speculation about his judgment, character, and potential involvement in criminal activities. Tom Henderson's ultimatum about Mark's job performance created immediate financial pressure that compounded his emotional distress. Mark had worked at Henderson's auto shop for 12 years, building a steady customer base and earning Tom's trust through reliable service and mechanical expertise. The revelation that his girlfriend was a wanted criminal who had been stealing money from local bank customers undermined everything Mark had accomplished professionally, making Tom question whether Mark had known about Rachel's criminal activities or had been an unwitting victim of her deception. Several longtime customers specifically requested that other mechanics handle their vehicle repairs, expressing discomfort with entrusting their cars to someone whose personal judgment was so questionable. Mrs. Patterson, whose family had used Henderson's services for 3 generations, told Tom directly that she couldn't continue bringing her car to a shop that employed someone who dated criminals and thieves. Harold Peterson, one of Rachel's elderly banking victims, canceled a major engine repair job rather than allow Mark to work on his truck, saying he couldn't trust anyone associated with the woman who had stolen his Social Security money. The financial implications of losing regular customers forced Tom to consider whether keeping Mark employed was economically viable, regardless of their personal relationship or Mark's technical skills. Henderson's auto shop depended on reputation and word-of-mouth referrals in a small community where people had multiple options for vehicle repairs. If customers continued to request different mechanics or took their business elsewhere entirely, Tom would have no choice but to terminate Mark's employment to protect the shop's long-term viability. Mark's attempts to explain his innocence and victimization to customers and community members were met with skepticism and awkward silence. People found it difficult to believe that someone could be intimately involved with a criminal for months without detecting signs of deception or illegal activity. The expensive gifts Mark had given Rachel, the lavish dinners they had shared, and the weekend trips they had taken together raised questions about whether Mark had benefited knowingly from stolen money or had simply been too infatuated to ask appropriate questions about Rachel's sudden financial resources. The social isolation that accompanied Mark's professional difficulties was equally devastating for someone who had lived in Millbrook his entire life. Former friends avoided him at local businesses and community events, uncertain how to navigate conversations about his relationship with a convicted criminal. Men who had previously included him in weekend fishing trips and holiday gatherings began making excuses when he expressed interest in joining their activities. The comfortable social networks that had supported Mark for decades were dissolving as people reassessed their relationships with someone whose judgment had proven so catastrophically flawed. Mark's attempts to reconcile with me became increasingly desperate as he realized that our marriage might be his only hope for rebuilding social acceptance and professional stability. He called me multiple times each day, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations that I was being vindictive by refusing to immediately forgive his infidelity. He seemed to believe that our marriage could be restored quickly if I simply chose to overlook his affair and focus on moving forward as a family, apparently not understanding the depth of trust that had been destroyed by his choices. During one particularly emotional conversation, Mark confessed that he had been borrowing money from our joint savings account to pay for gifts and activities with Rachel, withdrawing funds without my knowledge or consent. He had justified these expenditures by telling himself that he would repay the money once he decided whether to pursue divorce or reconciliation, but the discovery that Rachel's reciprocal gifts had been purchased with stolen bank funds made him realize that he had essentially been robbing our family to fund a relationship with a criminal. The revelation about the unauthorized withdrawals from our savings account transformed my sympathy for Mark's victimization into anger about his continued deception and financial irresponsibility. Not only had he destroyed our marriage by choosing another woman, but he had also stolen money from our children's future to support that relationship. The fact that Rachel had been simultaneously stealing money from bank customers to fund her participation in their affair created a grotesque cycle of theft and deception that implicated our entire family in criminal activity. I demanded a complete accounting of all money Mark had spent on Rachel, including gifts, dinners, hotel rooms, and any other expenses related to their relationship. The total amount exceeded $4,000 over 6 months, representing a significant portion of our emergency savings and money that had been earmarked for Emma's college expenses and Tyler's summer baseball camp fees. Mark's financial betrayal felt almost as devastating as his emotional infidelity, demonstrating that his poor judgment extended beyond romantic relationships to basic family responsibilities and ethical obligations. The stress of potential job loss, social isolation, and marital dissolution began affecting Mark's physical and mental health in noticeable ways. He lost weight rapidly, developed chronic insomnia, and began drinking heavily in the evenings to cope with anxiety and depression. Several people commented on his haggard appearance and erratic behavior, wondering whether he was struggling with substance abuse or having a nervous breakdown. His deteriorating condition became another source of community gossip and concern, further damaging his reputation and professional prospects. Tyler's anger toward his father intensified as he learned more details about Mark's financial irresponsibility and continued deception. The teenager had been saving money from his part-time job to attend a prestigious baseball camp that summer, and learning that his father had essentially stolen family money to support a criminal girlfriend made him feel betrayed on multiple levels. Tyler began refusing to spend time with Mark or answer his phone calls, telling me that he didn't want a relationship with someone who had chosen a thief over his own children. Emma's response was more complex but equally painful to witness. She continued to love her father but struggled with embarrassment about his public humiliation and poor judgment. Several of her friends had parents who were customers at First National Bank and had been affected by Rachel's theft, creating awkward social situations where Emma felt responsible for her father's association with a criminal. She began declining social invitations and avoiding school activities where she might encounter questions or comments about our family's situation. The ripple effects of Rachel's crimes and Mark's poor judgment were spreading throughout our community in ways that none of us had anticipated. Families who had trusted both Rachel and Mark were questioning their own ability to assess character and make sound decisions about relationships and business dealings. The bank was implementing new security procedures and background check requirements that affected all employees and customers. The church was revising its volunteer screening processes to prevent future incidents involving people with criminal histories. Linda Patterson's investigation into Rachel's banking activities revealed that the theft was more extensive and sophisticated than initially suspected. Rachel had been manipulating customer accounts for nearly her entire employment period, targeting not only elderly customers but also busy professionals who rarely reviewed their statements carefully. She had stolen money from single mothers struggling to pay bills, college students managing tight budgets, and small business owners who trusted the bank to handle their deposits accurately. The total amount of theft exceeded $8,000 across more than 30 customer accounts, making Rachel's crimes a significant financial and reputational disaster for First National Bank. Mr. Chen was forced to notify federal banking regulators about the security breach and implement costly new oversight procedures to prevent future incidents. Several major customers threatened to move their business to banks in larger cities unless First National could guarantee better protection for their funds and personal information. The convergence of legal proceedings, financial investigations, and social consequences created a pressure cooker environment that affected everyone connected to Rachel's web of deception. As her court dates approached and evidence mounted against her, the community's initial shock evolved into a more complex mixture of anger, embarrassment, and determination to prevent future incidents of fraud and manipulation. The woman who had seemed so charming and helpful just weeks earlier was now revealed as a calculating predator who had exploited trust and kindness for personal gain. Federal banking investigators arrived in Millbrook to conduct a comprehensive audit of First National Bank security procedures and customer account management systems. Their presence in our small community was both reassuring and unsettling, demonstrating that Rachel's crimes were serious enough to warrant federal attention while also suggesting that our local institutions had failed to protect residents from sophisticated financial fraud. The investigators interviewed dozens of bank employees, customers, and community members, gathering evidence for potential federal charges that could significantly increase Rachel's prison sentence. Detective Morrison's continued investigation into Rachel's activities in Cedar Rapids revealed additional victims and crimes that had not been included in the original charges against her. She had apparently been stealing money from customers at her previous bank job for over a year before the embezzlement was discovered, using increasingly sophisticated methods to avoid detection by supervisors and auditors. The pattern of escalating criminal behavior suggested that her activities in Millbrook represented a continuation of long-term criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. Carlos Torres's efforts to regain custody of his daughter were complicated by social services investigations into Rebecca's abandonment and the impact of her criminal activities on their child's welfare. Sophia had been living with Carlos's parents since Rebecca's disappearance, and the little girl was struggling with behavioral problems and academic difficulties that counselors attributed to maternal abandonment and family instability. The prospect of reuniting with her mother in prison was emotionally confusing for Sophia, who had been hoping for Rebecca's return but was too young to understand the complex legal and criminal circumstances surrounding her mother's absence. The media attention surrounding Rachel's arrest and the broader pattern of her criminal activities began attracting interest from regional news outlets and crime investigators who specialized in identity fraud and financial scams. A reporter from the Cedar Rapids Gazette contacted me for an interview about my role in exposing Rachel's true identity, though I declined to provide detailed comments about my investigative efforts or personal motivations. I was concerned that media coverage might portray me as vindictive or manipulative rather than focusing on Rachel's crimes and the community's collaborative efforts to protect vulnerable residents. Mark's deteriorating mental health became a source of genuine concern as he struggled to cope with the cascading consequences of his association with a criminal. He began attending counseling sessions with Pastor Williams, but his progress was limited by his continued focus on self-pity rather than accountability for his choices and their impact on our family. He seemed unable to understand that rebuilding trust would require consistent demonstration of improved judgment and commitment to family responsibilities, not just apologies and promises to do better in the future. The children's adjustment to our new reality was complicated by their father's emotional instability and the community's continued focus on our family's crisis. Emma began spending more time at friends' houses to avoid the tension and awkwardness that pervaded our home whenever Mark visited or called. Tyler threw himself into baseball and other activities that kept him busy and provided positive male role models through coaches and teammates' fathers. Both children were receiving counseling to help them process their feelings about their fathers' betrayal and develop healthy relationship expectations for their own futures. My own emotional journey was more complex than I had anticipated when I first decided to expose Rachel's true identity. While I felt satisfied that justice was being served and that our community was protected from further harm, I also struggled with unexpected feelings of sadness about the end of my marriage and uncertainty about our family's future. The strategic approach I had taken to destroy Rachel had been successful beyond my expectations, but it had also forced me to confront the reality that Mark's betrayal might have permanently damaged our relationship beyond repair. The practical challenges of potential divorce proceedings were daunting, particularly given Mark's deteriorating financial situation and the complications created by his association with criminal activities. I consulted with family law attorneys about protecting my interests and the children's welfare if Mark's professional difficulties led to significant income reduction or legal problems. The attorneys advised me to document all financial irregularities and maintain clear boundaries between my resources and any potential liability related to Mark's poor judgment. Church members and community leaders began approaching me about sharing my experience with other women who might be vulnerable to similar deception or manipulation. They suggested that my story could serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of background verification and the warning signs of sophisticated fraud. While I appreciated their confidence in my ability to help others, I was reluctant to become a public spokesperson for betrayal and revenge, preferring to maintain privacy about my personal motivations and investigative methods. The long-term impact of Rachel's crimes on Millbrook's social fabric was becoming apparent as people reassessed their assumptions about trust, verification, and community safety. Families who had previously welcomed newcomers without question began conducting informal background checks and asking more detailed questions about people's histories and references. The automatic trust that had characterized our small town relationships was being replaced by more cautious and protective approaches to new relationships and business dealings. Linda Patterson's reputation as a diligent and protective bank employee led to her promotion to assistant manager, with additional responsibilities for security oversight and employee background verification. Her success in identifying and stopping Rachel's theft had demonstrated the value of thorough investigation and attention to detail, qualities that Mr. Chen wanted to institutionalize throughout the bank's operations. Linda's advancement was particularly satisfying for me to witness, since her promotion resulted directly from acting on information I had provided while maintaining discretion about my motivations. The legal proceedings against Rachel moved forward, with multiple jurisdictions coordinating charges and evidence sharing to ensure that she faced appropriate consequences for the full scope of her criminal activities. Her attorney's attempts to negotiate plea agreements were complicated by the extensive pattern of fraud and the number of victims across different communities. Prosecutors seemed determined to pursue significant prison time to deter similar crimes and send a clear message about the consequences of exploiting small-town trust and vulnerability. The culmination of months of legal proceedings and community healing arrived on a crisp spring morning when Rebecca Torres, the woman we had known as Rachel Thompson, stood before Judge Patricia Coleman in the Cedar Rapids courthouse to receive her sentence. I had not attended any of the previous hearings, preferring to maintain my distance from the formal legal proceedings while supporting the community's recovery from her crimes. However, something compelled me to witness this final chapter in a story that had transformed my life and our entire community. Carlos Torres sat in the front row with his daughter Sofia, a beautiful 7-year-old who bore a striking resemblance to her mother but possessed an innocence that Rebecca had long since abandoned. The little girl clutched a stuffed rabbit and periodically whispered questions to her father about why they were in the courthouse and when they could go home. Carlos had explained to me earlier that Sophia still struggled to understand why her mother had left and whether Rebecca's return from prison would mean their family could be whole again. Detective Morrison and several other law enforcement officers occupied the prosecution side of the courtroom, their presence reflecting the seriousness of charges that spanned multiple jurisdictions and affected dozens of victims. The federal banking investigators who had spent weeks in Millbrook documenting Rachel's sophisticated theft schemes had compiled evidence demonstrating a pattern of criminal behavior that extended back several years and included crimes that had never been prosecuted due to her frequent relocations. Rachel's appearance shocked me with its dramatic change from the confident, attractive woman who had charmed her way into our community just months earlier. Prison clothing and the absence of professional styling had revealed her true age and the stress of facing significant prison time. She looked smaller and more vulnerable than I remembered, though I reminded myself that her current circumstances were entirely the result of choices she had made repeatedly over many years. Judge Coleman reviewed the extensive case file methodically, noting the progression from initial check fraud charges through embezzlement, identity theft, child abandonment, and the recent banking fraud that had been discovered in Millbrook. The prosecutor presented victim impact statements from elderly customers whose savings had been stolen, single mothers whose tight budgets had been further strained by Rachel's theft, and small business owners whose trust in financial institutions had been permanently damaged by her crimes. Linda Patterson had submitted a detailed statement describing how Rachel's sophisticated fraud schemes had undermined customer confidence in First National Bank and required expensive security upgrades to prevent future incidents. Mr. Chen's statement emphasized the broader impact of financial crimes on small communities where trust and personal relationships were essential to business operations and economic stability. Several Millbrook residents had written letters describing how Rachel's deception had made them more suspicious and less welcoming to newcomers, fundamentally altering the character of their community. The defense attorney's plea for leniency focused on Rachel's troubled childhood, her struggles with addiction and mental health issues, and her claimed desire to reform her behavior and rebuild relationships with her daughter and estranged husband. He argued that long-term incarceration would prevent Rachel from making restitution to her victims and would further traumatize her daughter, who needed maternal support despite Rebecca's past mistakes. The attorney suggested that supervised probation and mandatory counseling would better serve the interests of justice and rehabilitation. Judge Coleman's response to these arguments reflected both compassion for Rachel's personal struggles and recognition that her pattern of criminal behavior required significant consequences to protect future potential victims. The judge noted that Rachel had received probation and second chances for previous crimes but had consistently chosen to escalate her criminal activities rather than seeking legitimate employment and honest relationships. The abandonment of her young daughter was particularly troubling to Judge Coleman, who emphasized that Rachel's choices had created lasting trauma for an innocent child. The sentence that Judge Coleman imposed exceeded what Rachel's attorney had hoped for but fell short of the maximum penalties that prosecutors had requested. Rebecca Torres was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for the banking fraud charges, with an additional 18 months for the original embezzlement and identity theft charges from Cedar Rapids. She would be eligible for parole after serving 60% of her sentence if she demonstrated good behavior and participated in required rehabilitation programs. Judge Coleman also ordered Rachel to pay full restitution to all identified victims, though she acknowledged that Rachel's current financial situation made immediate payment unlikely. The restitution order would remain in effect after Rachel's release from prison, with wage garnishment and asset seizure available to ensure that victims eventually recovered their stolen funds. Rachel would also be required to register as a financial offender and submit to regular monitoring by probation officers for 5 years after her release. The judge's final comments addressed the broader impact of Rachel's crimes on community trust and social cohesion. Judge Coleman noted that financial fraud in small communities created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate monetary losses suffered by individual victims. She emphasized that people like Rachel who exploited small-town hospitality and trust were undermining the social fabric that made communities like Millbrook safe and welcoming places to live and raise families. As court officers led Rachel away to begin serving her sentence, she glanced briefly at her daughter and ex-husband before her gaze fell on me sitting several rows behind them. For just a moment, our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw recognition flash across her face as she realized that the quiet church secretary from Millbrook had been present to witness her final defeat. I maintained steady eye contact until she looked away, wanting her to understand that justice had been served and that her victims had not been forgotten or intimidated by her crimes. Carlos Torres approached me after the sentencing to express His gratitude once again for my role in locating Rebecca and ensuring that she faced appropriate consequences for her actions. He explained that Sophia was beginning to show signs of recovery from the trauma of maternal abandonment, particularly now that she understood her mother's absence was related to Rebecca's choices rather than anything Sophia had done wrong. Carlos had remarried a wonderful woman who was helping him provide Sophia with the stable, loving home environment she needed to heal and develop healthy relationships. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to reflect on the long journey from that devastating Christmas morning when I had watched Rachel open presents under my tree to this moment of final legal resolution. The woman who had tried to steal my life had lost her freedom, her daughter, her marriage, and any hope of continuing the pattern of deception and theft that had defined her adult existence. Meanwhile, I had discovered strengths and capabilities I had never known I possessed, using my knowledge and connections to protect my community while rebuilding my own life on a foundation of dignity and purpose. The weeks following Rachel's sentencing marked a period of profound adjustment for everyone whose lives had been affected by her crimes and deception. Mark's situation deteriorated rapidly as the full scope of his association with a convicted criminal became clear to employers, customers, and community members who had previously been willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Tom Henderson's patience finally exhausted completely when two more longtime customers requested different mechanics specifically because they didn't want Mark working on their vehicles. The termination conversation took place on a Friday afternoon in Tom's office, with Mark begging for another chance and promising that his personal problems would never again affect his work performance. Tom explained that the decision wasn't based on Mark's technical abilities or even his recent work quality, but on the simple business reality that customers were taking their vehicles elsewhere rather than risk association with someone whose judgment had proven so catastrophically flawed. The auto shop's reputation had been built over 3 decades of reliable service and community trust, and Tom couldn't allow one employee's personal mistakes to destroy what multiple generations had worked to establish. Mark's unemployment created immediate financial pressure that compounded his emotional distress and social isolation. Without steady income, he couldn't afford to maintain his apartment and was forced to ask his elderly parents if he could temporarily move back into their basement. The humiliation of returning to his childhood bedroom at age 42, after losing his wife, children, job, and community standing because of an affair with a criminal, pushed Mark into a depression that concerned everyone who had known him throughout his life. His parents, Jim and Dorothy Miller, struggled to balance their love for their son with their disappointment in his choices and their concern about the impact of his presence on their own social relationships. Several of their longtime friends had been victims of Rachel's banking fraud, creating awkward dynamics when Mark was present at family gatherings or community events. Dorothy, in particular, found it difficult to defend Mark's behavior to her bridge club and church circle, where the consensus was that any man who would abandon his family for a criminal deserved whatever consequences he faced. The children's visits with Mark became increasingly strained as his living situation deteriorated and his emotional stability remained fragile. Tyler continued to refuse most contact with his father, still angry about the money Mark had stolen from their family savings to support his relationship with Rachel. Emma made more effort to maintain their relationship, but she found it difficult to spend time with Mark when he was so focused on his own problems that he seemed unable to recognize the impact of his choices on his children's lives. My own position in the community evolved in unexpected ways as people gradually learned about my role in exposing Rachel's true identity and protecting potential future victims from her crimes. While I had been careful to downplay my investigative efforts and emphasize the collaborative nature of uncovering Rachel's deception, several key community members understood that my knowledge and connections had been crucial to stopping her criminal activities. This recognition brought respect and gratitude, but also a level of attention that sometimes felt uncomfortable for someone who preferred to work behind the scenes. Pastor Williams asked me to consider sharing my experience with other churches in the region that were struggling to develop effective volunteer screening procedures. He believed that my story could help other communities avoid similar incidents by demonstrating the importance of thorough background checks and attention to inconsistencies in personal histories. While I appreciated his confidence in my ability to help others, I was reluctant to become a public speaker about betrayal and investigation, preferring to maintain privacy about my personal motivations and methods. The women's Bible study group that had supported me throughout the crisis began discussing broader questions about forgiveness, justice, and protecting vulnerable community members from exploitation. Several members expressed admiration for my strategic approach to dealing with Rachel's crimes, though others worried that my methods reflected a desire for revenge rather than biblical principles of reconciliation and mercy. These conversations helped me process my own feelings about The balance between seeking justice and maintaining Christian values in difficult circumstances. Linda Patterson's promotion to assistant manager at First National Bank included responsibilities for developing new security protocols and employee screening procedures that would prevent future incidents of internal fraud. Her success in identifying and stopping Rachel's theft had made her a regional expert on financial crimes in small communities, leading to consulting opportunities with other banks and credit unions that wanted to improve their protection against sophisticated fraud schemes. Linda's professional advancement was particularly satisfying for me to witness, since it resulted directly from her willingness to act on information I had provided while maintaining discretion about my motivations. The broader impact of Rachel's crimes on Millbrook's social dynamics continued to evolve as residents adjusted their assumptions about trust, verification, and community safety. The automatic hospitality that had characterized our small town culture was being tempered by more cautious approaches to welcoming newcomers and verifying their backgrounds. While this increased skepticism might protect against future deception, it also represented a loss of innocence and openness that had made Millbrook a special place to live and raise families. Several community organizations began implementing formal background check requirements for volunteers and employees, recognizing that good intentions and personal references were insufficient protection against sophisticated criminals who specialized in exploiting trust and generosity. The additional administrative burden and expense of these verification procedures created practical challenges for nonprofit organizations that depended on volunteer labor and operated with limited budgets, but most community leaders agreed that the protection of vulnerable residents justified the increased costs and complexity. Mark's attempts to find new employment were hampered by his association with Rachel's crimes and the small-town network that ensured his story was known to potential employers throughout the region. Several job interviews ended awkwardly when employers learned about his relationship with a convicted criminal, even though Mark had not been charged with any crimes himself. The assumption that he must have known about Rachel's illegal activities, or at least should have detected warning signs, made many employers reluctant to risk hiring someone whose judgment had been so demonstrably poor. The financial stress of unemployment forced Mark to consider relocating to a larger city where his association with Rachel might be less well known and his employment prospects might be better. However, moving away from Millbrook would mean abandoning any hope of rebuilding relationships with his children and would confirm his status as a community outcast who couldn't face the consequences of his actions. The choice between staying to fight for redemption and leaving to start over somewhere else became another source of anxiety and depression that further undermined his mental health and decision-making ability. The legal proceedings related to victim restitution continued to unfold as prosecutors worked to identify all of Rachel's crimes and calculate the full extent of financial damages she had caused. The process was complicated by her use of multiple identities and her pattern of relocating frequently to avoid detection, making it likely that some victims would never be identified or compensated for their losses. The incomplete nature of justice for Rachel's crimes was frustrating for community members who wanted complete accountability and full restoration for everyone who had been harmed by her deception. The months following Rachel's sentencing brought a gradual healing to Millbrook that reminded me why I had chosen to fight for our community rather than simply walking away from the chaos she had created. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal, and our small town began the process of rebuilding trust while implementing the lessons we had learned about protecting ourselves from sophisticated deception. The scars left by Rachel's crimes would remain visible for years to come, but they served as reminders of our resilience and our commitment to supporting each other through difficult times. My own life settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and entirely new. The house that had once felt empty and violated after Mark's betrayal became a sanctuary where I could focus on healing and rediscovering who I was beyond the roles of wife and victim. Emma and Tyler adjusted to our new normal with the resilience that teenagers often display when their parents provide consistent support and honest communication about complex situations. Both children continued to struggle with their relationship with Mark, but they were developing healthy boundaries and realistic expectations about rebuilding trust with someone whose judgment had proven so unreliable. The church secretary position that had once felt routine and predictable took on new meaning as I used my experience to help other communities develop better protection against fraud and exploitation. Pastor Williams encouraged me to share my knowledge with regional church networks, and I found myself consulting with congregations throughout Iowa about volunteer screening procedures and warning signs of sophisticated deception. These speaking engagements allowed me to transform my painful experience into something beneficial for others while maintaining privacy about my personal motivations and investigative methods. Linda Patterson's success at First National Bank continued to flourish as she implemented security reforms that became models for other financial institutions throughout the region. Her promotion to assistant manager included responsibilities for training other employees to recognize fraud patterns and suspicious behavior, making her an expert in protecting small-town banks from internal theft. Linda often credited our collaboration during the Rachel investigation with teaching her the value of thorough background verification and attention to seemingly minor inconsistencies in personal histories. The community's response to my role in exposing Rachel evolved from gratitude to genuine respect as people recognized that my actions had protected not just individual victims but the social fabric that made Millbrook a safe and welcoming place to live. Several elderly residents who had been targeted by Rachel's banking fraud made special efforts to thank me for preventing further theft from their accounts. Harold Peterson, in particular, became a strong advocate for my speaking engagements, telling anyone who would listen that my thoroughness and courage had saved him from losing even more of his Social Security money. Mark's situation remained precarious as he struggled to rebuild his life from the basement of his parents' house. While dealing with unemployment, depression, and the ongoing consequences of his association with a convicted criminal, his efforts to find work were hampered by his reputation throughout the region, forcing him to consider options that would require relocating far from Millbrook and accepting jobs that paid significantly less than his previous position at Henderson's auto shop. The prospect of starting over in a new community while maintaining long-distance relationships with his children created additional stress that complicated his recovery from the emotional trauma of being deceived by Rachel. Several months after Rachel's sentencing, Mark approached me about the possibility of reconciliation, suggesting that our shared experience of being victimized by her deception could provide a foundation for rebuilding our marriage. His proposal reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the damage that had been done to our relationship, focusing on Rachel's crimes rather than acknowledging his own choices to betray our family and steal money from our savings to support his affair. I listened to his arguments with patience and sadness, recognizing that the man I had once loved was still unable to take full responsibility for the consequences of his decisions. The conversation about reconciliation lasted for several hours over multiple meetings, with Mark alternating between promises to be a better husband and father and complaints that I was being unforgiving and vindictive by refusing to immediately restore our marriage. He seemed to believe that forgiving him for being deceived by Rachel should be relatively easy, since he had ultimately been a victim of her manipulation rather than a willing participant in her crimes. This perspective demonstrated that Mark still didn't understand the depth of trust that had been broken when he chose to pursue another woman and use our family's money to support that relationship. I explained to Mark that rebuilding trust would require consistent demonstration of improved judgment, financial responsibility, and commitment to our children's welfare over an extended period of time. His current unemployment and emotional instability made it impossible for me to consider reconciliation when he couldn't even provide basic financial support for Emma and Tyler's needs. More importantly, his continued focus on his own victimization rather than the impact of his choices on our family suggested that he hadn't developed the self-awareness necessary for a healthy marriage relationship. The decision to pursue divorce rather than reconciliation was difficult but ultimately necessary for my own healing and our children's stability. Mark's inability to find steady employment and his continued emotional volatility made him an unreliable partner and father, regardless of whether he had been deceived by Rachel about her criminal background. The marriage that had once provided security and partnership had been irreparably damaged by his choices, and attempting to rebuild it would require sacrificing my own growth and independence for someone who hadn't demonstrated consistent commitment to change. Emma and Tyler supported my decision to divorce their father, though they expressed sadness about the permanent end of our family structure. Both children had matured significantly during the crisis, developing insights about relationships and character that would serve them well in their own future partnerships. Emma began talking about studying criminal justice in college, inspired by watching how law enforcement and community members had worked together to expose Rachel's crimes and protect vulnerable residents. Tyler channeled his anger about his father's poor judgment into determination to make better decisions in his own life, becoming more serious about academics and athletics while maintaining respectful relationships with coaches and mentors. The divorce proceedings were complicated by Mark's unemployment and the discovery that he had been hiding additional financial irregularities beyond the money he had stolen from our savings to support his relationship with Rachel. He had been charging personal expenses on our joint credit cards without my knowledge, accumulating debt that I would have been responsible for if I hadn't insisted on a thorough financial investigation. The attorney I hired specializing in complex divorces involving financial deception was able to protect my interests and ensure that Mark's irresponsible spending didn't compromise my ability to support our children or maintain our home. Carlos Torres maintained contact with me throughout this period, providing updates about Sophia's recovery and his own process of rebuilding his life after Rebecca's betrayal and abandonment. The little girl was showing remarkable resilience with the help of counseling and the support of Carlos's new wife, who had embraced Sophia as her own daughter. Carlos expressed gratitude that Rebecca was facing appropriate consequences for her crimes, though he remained focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on anger about the past. His example of grace and determination inspired me during my own journey toward healing and independence. The community's adjustment to life after Rachel's exposure continued to evolve as residents found ways to maintain their traditional hospitality while protecting themselves from future deception. Several organizations implemented new volunteer screening procedures without losing their welcoming character, and local businesses developed informal networks for sharing information about suspicious behavior or questionable backgrounds. The balance between openness and caution required ongoing attention, but most residents agreed that protecting vulnerable community members justified the additional effort and complexity. Pastor Williams began incorporating lessons from the Rachel situation into his sermons and counseling sessions, emphasizing the importance of wisdom and discernment in relationships while maintaining Christian principles of forgiveness and redemption. He often used my example of strategic response to injustice as a model for how faith communities could protect themselves without compromising their values of mercy and grace. His theological framework helped many community members process their feelings about Rachel's crimes and their satisfaction with her punishment while maintaining their commitment to spiritual growth and moral behavior. The regional attention that our community received for successfully exposing and prosecuting financial fraud led to opportunities for Millbrook to serve as a model for other small towns facing similar challenges. State banking regulators invited Linda Patterson and other community leaders to participate in workshops about fraud prevention, and several academic researchers requested interviews about our collaborative approach to protecting vulnerable residents. The positive recognition helped restore community pride while providing practical resources for other towns dealing with similar threats. 2 years after Rachel's imprisonment, Millbrook had developed a new equilibrium that incorporated the lessons learned from her deception while preserving the community values that made our town a special place to live and raise families. The healing process had been gradual and sometimes difficult, requiring residents to balance appropriate caution with the trust and generosity that had always characterized our relationships with neighbors and newcomers. The scars left by Rachel's crimes remained visible in new policies and procedures, but they served as reminders of our strength and resilience rather than sources of ongoing fear or suspicion. Emma graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to study criminal justice at the University of Iowa, fulfilling her goal of working in law enforcement to help protect communities from criminals like Rachel. Her academic success and career focus impressed college admissions officers who were looking for students with real-world experience and mature perspectives on justice and public service. Emma's personal statement about witnessing her community's response to sophisticated fraud demonstrated the kind of character and motivation that universities valued in their criminal justice programs. Tyler continued to excel in baseball while maintaining strong academic performance, earning recognition from college scouts who were impressed by his discipline and work ethic. His relationship with Mark remained strained but civil, with Tyler accepting that his father had been both a victim of deception and responsible for poor choices that had damaged their family. Tyler's maturity in handling this complex situation impressed coaches and teachers who saw him as a natural leader among his peers. My work consulting with churches and community organizations about fraud prevention had evolved into a part-time business that provided both income and personal satisfaction. The speaking engagements and training workshops allowed me to share practical knowledge while maintaining privacy about my personal motivations and experiences. Church leaders throughout the region requested my services for volunteer training and security assessments, recognizing that my background and expertise could help them protect their congregations from exploitation. Mark's life stabilized somewhat when he finally found employment at an auto repair shop in Cedar Rapids, though the job paid significantly less than his previous position and required a lengthy commute that limited his time with Emma and Tyler. His relationship with our children improved gradually as he demonstrated more consistent behavior and financial responsibility, though neither Emma nor Tyler expressed interest in spending extended time with him. Mark's new girlfriend, a divorced mother who worked as a nurse, seemed more mature and stable than Rachel had been, though I remained cautious about her influence on any interactions with our children. The divorce settlement provided me with enough financial security to maintain our home and support the children's education while building a foundation for my own retirement. Mark's reduced income affected his ability to contribute significantly to college expenses, but Emma's scholarship and Tyler's athletic prospects suggested that both children would have opportunities to pursue higher education without creating financial hardship for our family. The house that had once felt violated by Rachel's presence became a sanctuary where I could focus on personal growth and professional development. Linda Patterson's career continued to flourish as she became a recognized expert in small-town banking security, eventually accepting a position with the state banking department that allowed her to help implement fraud prevention policies throughout Iowa. Her success provided a positive example of how crisis situations could create opportunities for professional advancement when people responded with competence and integrity. Linda maintained our friendship while advancing her career, often crediting our collaboration during the Rachel investigation with teaching her valuable lessons about thoroughness and attention to detail. The First National Bank recovered from the reputation damage caused by Rachel's theft, implementing new security measures that actually enhanced customer confidence rather than creating anxiety about safety. Mr. Chen's transparent communication about the theft and the steps taken to prevent future incidents demonstrated the kind of leadership that strengthened rather than weakened community trust. Several customers who had considered moving their accounts to other banks decided to stay with First National because they appreciated the honest handling of the crisis and the improved security procedures. Carlos Torres sent annual Christmas cards updating me about Sophia's progress and their family's continued healing from Rebecca's abandonment. The little girl was thriving in school and had formed a strong relationship with her stepmother, though she occasionally asked questions about her biological mother that required careful and honest responses. Carlos expressed ongoing gratitude for my role in locating Rebecca and ensuring that she faced appropriate consequences for her crimes, though he remained focused on building a positive future rather than dwelling on past betrayals. Rachel's imprisonment continued without incident, according to periodic updates from Detective Morrison, who monitored her progress through the correctional system. She had reportedly participated in required rehabilitation programs and maintained good behavior, making her eligible for earlier parole consideration if she continued to demonstrate positive changes. The prospect of her eventual release created some anxiety among her victims, though law enforcement assured community members that extensive monitoring and restitution requirements would limit her ability to commit similar crimes. The broader impact of Rachel's case on Iowa's criminal justice system included new protocols for tracking individuals who used multiple identities to commit fraud across different jurisdictions. Legislative changes strengthened penalties for financial crimes targeting elderly victims and improved coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating identity theft and banking fraud. These systemic improvements would help protect future potential victims while ensuring that criminals like Rachel faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Community organizations throughout the region began requesting training sessions about fraud prevention and volunteer screening, recognizing that small towns were particularly vulnerable to individuals who specialized in exploiting trust and generosity. My consulting work expanded to include workshops for seniors about financial safety, church volunteer coordinators about background verification, and business owners about employment screening. The transformation of my painful personal experience into practical assistance for others provided a sense of purpose and meaning that helped sustain my own healing process. Pastor Williams used our community's experience with Rachel as a foundation for developing resources to help other congregations protect themselves from exploitation while maintaining their mission of welcome and service. The curriculum he created included biblical principles for balancing wisdom with mercy, practical guidelines for volunteer screening, and case studies that illustrated how sophisticated criminals operated in faith communities. His work attracted attention from denominational leaders who were looking for effective approaches to protecting vulnerable church members. The tourism and economic development that had always been important to Millbrook's prosperity continued, without lasting damage from the scandal surrounding Rachel's crimes. In fact, the community's effective response to fraud and our collaborative approach to protecting vulnerable residents became selling points for families considering relocating to small-town Iowa. The balance we had achieved between maintaining our welcoming character and implementing appropriate security measures demonstrated the kind of thoughtful leadership that attracted new residents and businesses. 5 years after the Christmas morning that changed everything, I stood in my kitchen preparing for another holiday season with a sense of peace and accomplishment that would have been unimaginable during those dark days when Rachel was opening presents under my tree. The woman who had tried to steal my life was serving the remainder of her prison sentence while I had built something better than what I had lost. The journey from victim to victor had required more strength than I knew I possessed, but it had also revealed capabilities and purposes that transformed my understanding of who I could become. Emma was completing her junior year at the University of Iowa with outstanding grades in her criminal justice program and an internship with the State Attorney General's office that provided practical experience in prosecuting financial crimes. Her professors recognized her natural aptitude for investigation and her mature understanding of how criminal behavior affected communities, qualities that positioned her for a successful career in law enforcement or prosecution. Emma often credited her experience with Rachel's deception for motivating her academic focus and career goals, though she had developed a sophisticated understanding of justice that went beyond personal revenge. Tyler had accepted a baseball scholarship to a small college in Nebraska where he could pursue his athletic dreams while studying business management. His relationship with Mark had stabilized into respectful but limited contact, with Tyler accepting his father's flaws while maintaining boundaries that protected his own emotional well-being. Tyler's coaches and teachers consistently praised his leadership abilities and character, recognizing that he had learned valuable lessons about integrity and responsibility from witnessing the consequences of poor judgment in his own family. The consulting business I had developed around fraud prevention and community safety had grown beyond my expectations, providing both financial independence and professional fulfillment that enriched my life in ways I had never anticipated. Churches, nonprofit organizations, and small businesses throughout the Midwest requested my services for security assessments, volunteer training, and policy development. The reputation I had built for thorough investigation and practical solutions attracted clients who wanted effective protection without compromising their missions of service and welcome. Mark's life had found a more stable foundation through his relationship with Janet, the nurse he had been dating for 3 years, though his emotional and financial recovery remained incomplete. He had finally accepted responsibility for his role in our family's crisis, acknowledging that his choices rather than Rachel's deception had been the primary cause of our divorce and his children's loss of trust in him. This recognition had enabled him to rebuild limited but genuine relationships with Emma and Tyler, though neither child expressed interest in spending holidays or extended time with him. The community of Millbrook had integrated the lessons learned from Rachel's crimes into its social fabric without losing the warmth and generosity that made our town special. New residents were welcomed enthusiastically while being invited to participate in verification processes that had become routine rather than suspicious. Local businesses and organizations had developed informal networks for sharing information about potential problems while maintaining respect for privacy and due process. The balance between openness and protection required ongoing attention, but it had become a source of pride rather than anxiety for most residents. Linda Patterson's career with the state banking department had flourished as she developed expertise in rural financial security that made her a sought-after consultant for banks and credit unions throughout the region. Her success demonstrated how crisis situations could create opportunities for professional growth when people responded with competence and dedication to protecting others. Linda remained one of my closest friends, often sharing stories about fraud cases she was investigating and seeking advice about community-based approaches to prevention and detection. Pastor Williams had retired from full-time ministry but continued to lead workshops about faith-based responses to deception and exploitation, using our community's experience as a model for balancing Christian mercy with practical wisdom. His theological framework for understanding justice and forgiveness in complex situations had influenced denominational policies and seminary curricula throughout the Midwest. His mentorship had been crucial to my own spiritual growth during the difficult years following Mark's betrayal and Rachel's exposure. The house that had once felt violated by Rachel's presence had become a sanctuary where I entertained friends, hosted Bible study meetings, and enjoyed the peaceful solitude that came with knowing I was exactly where I belonged. The Christmas decorations that filled every room during the holiday season represented joy and celebration rather than the hollow performance they had become during the final years of my marriage to Mark. The tree positioned in the front window, where neighbors could admire it from the street, symbolized my commitment to maintaining traditions while building something entirely new. Carlos Torres had maintained our friendship through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls that provided updates about his family's continued healing and growth. Sophia was now 12 years old and thriving academically and socially, with only occasional questions about her biological mother that required careful and honest responses. Carlos had been promoted to supervisor at his manufacturing job and was considering pursuing additional education that would qualify him for management positions. His example of grace and determination in rebuilding his life after betrayal continued to inspire my own journey toward wholeness and purpose. Rachel's scheduled release from prison in 18 months created some anxiety among her former victims, though law enforcement had assured community members that extensive monitoring and restitution requirements would limit her ability to commit similar crimes. Detective Morrison had explained that Rachel would be required to register as a financial offender, submit to regular meetings with parole officers, and maintain legitimate employment that could be verified by authorities. The prospect of her return to society served as a reminder that vigilance and preparation were ongoing responsibilities rather than temporary responses to crisis. The speaking engagements and training workshops that had grown from my personal experience continued to provide opportunities to help other communities protect themselves from sophisticated fraud and exploitation. The transformation of painful experience into practical assistance for others had become a source of meaning and purpose that sustained my own healing while contributing to broader social good. Each workshop participant who learned to recognize warning signs or implement better verification procedures represented another potential victim who might be protected from criminals like Rachel. The regional and state recognition that Millbrook had received for our collaborative response to financial fraud had attracted positive attention from economic development officials and prospective residents who valued communities that could balance security with hospitality. Our town's reputation for effective problem-solving and mutual support had become an asset in attracting new businesses and families who wanted to live in places where people looked out for each other. The crisis that had threatened to undermine community trust had ultimately strengthened our social bonds and enhanced our appeal to outsiders. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.